Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start by encouraging you with the most important truth in the entire universe. Maybe encouraging isn't right, maybe challenging you with the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. I can't begin to stress enough that as we go through this series looking at us, how we came from being a lifeless planet to us sitting here today discussing these things, that the fingerprint of design is not only going to come into view, but it's going to be on full display. And I'll back that up in the weeks to come. But what I want to stress to you, I think we've talked about through this whole process, that God has carefully crafted, I shouldn't say that. I'll take that back for a moment. That an intelligent designer is the most likely explanation for where we find ourselves today. And that intelligent designer seems to have built the universe around us and this little blue planet that we find ourselves on with enormous care and enormous love to build it around us, to offer us the opportunity for a relationship with that creator. And lots more things to go before we get there in our journey. I understand that. Sometimes when I say statements like that, it's difficult to piece together how much of a compliment that is to you. Because I think sometimes when we talk about the universe or the planet or the solar system, you kind of go, well, they're out there, and I guess if there is a creator, then it does somewhat reflect that creator is interested in doing something for me. But throughout this series, I hope every one of us will take a moment and look in the mirror and be blown away by the love and the care and the attention that went into making you. You are loved so much that God took all of this care and attention to bring you into existence. And I hope that you'll see that as we take this journey forward. Now, this week we're going to start with a couple of quotes from our old friend Richard Dawkins. And the reason I'm wearing my hoodie and the reason we're doing this is we're going to talk about hiking this week. I entitled this week's episode Falling Off of Mount Improbable, in reference to Dawkins' Climbing Mount Improbable, and also, I think, in some ways, to his work on The Blind Watchmaker. What we're going to find, and I struggled a little bit with how to take this first step into this series, and I want it to be this, because I think we're going to see throughout this series, as we talk about how we are put together, that we're going to reference back to this issue time and time again. Richard Dawkins, to his credit, I think does maybe the best job of putting together an outstanding example and explanation. If atheism or naturalism were true, then how could we explain the tremendous complexity that we see in biological life around us? How would that possibly have happened? Dawkins, in Climbing Mount Improbable, I think, hats off, I think he gets full credit for one of the best examples possible in this journey. Now, as we're going to see tonight as we look at it, I think his example completely falls apart when you really place it under scrutiny. But I think it's maybe one of the best examples that naturalism can put on the table. And so whether we're talking about The Blind Watchmaker and Richard Dawkins' evolutionary algorithm that he puts in place to show how DNA and RNA could have potentially brought, how intelligence could have been brought into the equation, or whether it's a bigger picture perspective from Climbing Mount Improbable, I think you're going to see the same problem over and over and again throughout our journey. And that problem is a couple of different things. But first and foremost, the problem that you've got from a naturalistic perspective is the only way that you can explain these things is to inject intelligence into the argument. And it's done ever so subtly. And I don't think there's a realization that that's what's happening. But we're going to see it tonight in this journey, and we're going to talk about it in relation to what Dawkins is doing and the arguments that he makes. So I want to read the quote. This is from the God Delusion, but he's referencing Climbing Mount Improbable. And I think he does a really good job of summarizing the point that he's trying to make here. So I'm going to read this quote, and then we're going to talk about why this idea falls apart under analysis. All right. So again, this is from the God Delusion, referencing his book, Climbing Mount Improbable. Dawkins says, in Climbing Mount Improbable, I express the point in a parable. One side of the mountain is a sheer cliff, impossible to climb, but on the other side is a gentle slope to the summit. On the summit sits a complex device, such as an eye or a bacterial flagellar motor. The eye is the one we're going to come back to. The absurd notion that such complexity could spontaneously self-assemble is symbolized, that such complexity could spontaneously self-assemble is symbolized by leaping from the foot of the cliff to the top in one bound. Evolution, by contrast, goes around the back of the mountain and creeps up the gentle slope to the summit. Easy. Okay. I think that's an excellent illustration that he's given. I think it's a wonderful metaphor for what we're looking at here and what naturalism puts on the table. What he's saying is, if you have something like the eye, which even Darwin recognized was enormously complex, so much so that it was very problematic for his theory, that if you simply, instead of trying to leap to how it could have evolved in one giant leap, you just take it in little tiny bites, and you go around to the back of the mountain and you climb up the back of the mountain. So here's the problem with that, and the reason I'm wearing one of my favorite hoodies tonight. So I've climbed a mountain before, and in my experience, there is a beautiful group of lakes and mountain in the middle of Rocky Mountain National Park. And as you drive through the park, on the main park road, you look across the valley and you can see these lakes just beckoning to you. And the valley that they sit in looks beautiful. And I think everyone who drives through that park practically has to look at that and go, wow, those are amazing. My entire life, I wanted to climb that mountain to get to those lakes. And the year I turned 30, a very good friend of mine and I made the trek. We left at about 4 in the morning, and we got back from the end of the journey about 4:30 in the afternoon, so about 12 and a half hours. And along the way, we saw some of the most breathtaking scenery imaginable. But it was a brutal hike, and I won't sugarcoat it at all. We hiked across the mountain range. We climbed to the summit of one of the mountains. We dropped down from that summit into these lakes, which were just breathtaking by all accounts. And then we had to climb our way back out. And this is one of those experiences I think a lot of hikers go through. I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. And I also recognize I can't ever go back. At this point in my life, I'm a little bit too old and a little bit too out of shape. And I think if I had to do it all over again, I don't know that I would, but I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. It was amazing. We're going to use that story of mine as we talk about Dawkins' analogy throughout this process tonight, because there are some real parallels that show exactly where his Climbing Mount Improbable starts to break down. So the very first problem ought to jump off the page to everybody. Where does the prize come from on top of the mountain? Now, he gives 2 examples, the eye or a bacterial flagellar motor. In either case, an enormous evolutionary feat, no question, or a feat of design, no question. But when we look at either one of them, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, well, we, through the process of intelligence, recognize that there's a prize on top of the mountain. How is it that natural selection recognizes that there's something worthwhile to go to? See, the problem is a prize at the summit of the mountain is something that only intelligence can recognize. We're talking about something that becomes a prize at the end of the journey. The eye, at the beginning of the journey, has no purpose. The idea of sight is an incredibly complex idea when you really think about it. We take it for granted because, well, I mean, let's be honest, we can see. But when you can't, when you're caught in pitch black darkness, or if you have eye problems or something like that, you quickly come to recognize that the idea of sight, the concept itself, is an incredibly complex and amazing concept. And something like the eye, whether it's a complex eye like ours or even more complex if you think about something like an eagle or something like that has much better vision than we do, where does natural selection suddenly grasp the intelligence to determine that the prize on top of the mountain is a prize worth pursuing? This is the problem that you've got, is immediately in his example, you've snuck intelligence into the process. because only intelligence can recognize at the end of the journey there is something of value that I need to pursue. And I don't want to oversimplify natural selection or evolution, because neo-Darwinian evolution is not the exact same theory that Darwin proposed. It's similar to what he proposed 100 some odd years ago, but it is different. And I think modern evolutionists today would stick less to an idea of a strictly unguided process. And there's a great many ideas thrown in there, but at its very foundation and function, it is an unguided process. It's unguided through various steps and things like that. I won't say it's a totally blind process as it's envisioned today, but it's certainly an unguided process. And the idea that intelligence can recognize a prize on top of Mount Improbable is highly problematic, because only intelligence can recognize that. And natural selection has no such capability. If you'll remember, and one of the things we've talked about is, one of the criticisms that Darwin faced was that he oftentimes was accused of giving natural selection godlike powers. Here's a prime example of where we see that problem continuing forward today. So the very first problem that we have is to recognize the value of the prize sitting on top of the mountain requires intelligence to do so, and natural selection has no such thing. So number one, right off the bat, we've got a huge problem going forward. Now, number two, when you really think about this, raises the question of why start the journey. When I was 30 years old and that friend of mine and I took off to go do that hike, it was just the two of us that day. My lovely wife was perhaps wise enough to enjoy her vacation that day and to spend the day relaxing and swimming with our kids and enjoying herself. And at the end of the day, she wasn't limping. She wasn't groaning in pain. Now, granted, she didn't get to go on the hike either, but I think in many ways she would argue she made the better decision. We both knew the prize. We both recognized what was there. And here's a picture, by the way. Well, I flashed this a couple of times along the way, but this is the valley, and then this is me standing on the summit. In these areas, when you think about it, it takes a very conscious decision when you're going to go on a journey like this to start the journey. I made a conscious decision to start the journey. Again, going back to the first step, I recognized the prize. I saw the lakes that I wanted to reach, those lakes right there. They were amazing. There's me sitting on the shore of one of them. The lakes were phenomenal. They were beautiful, and it was everything I expected, but it took an enormous amount of planning. It took an enormous amount of effort to get there. I made the decision to start the journey. It was a conscious, intelligent decision. So not only do I have to recognize that there's a prize on top of the mountain, but the second problem that I've got is then I have to make the decision that the prize is worth pursuing, and I have to start the journey. You can't just jump in at the end. Remember, the concept of evolution, we have microevolution, which means existing things change. We recognize that. That's why we have 10,000 breeds of doodles out there, all sorts of dogs that have been bred with poodles. That's microevolution. We all agree that species change. But we're talking here about macroevolution. How is it that you could develop the eye or some complex system within the body or something else? To begin the journey requires an intelligent decision to move forward. Dawkins seems to gloss right over that and just jump to the conclusion, well, obviously natural selection makes that choice. But natural selection is a process that is unguided to that point, and it cannot make any choice. It can eliminate things that are already in development. It can encourage things by eliminating one and encouraging the other through a process that, whether we call it survival of the fittest or natural selection, that process can encourage existing things to change, but it can't make the decision to set out to find something new. And his example of climbing Mount Improbable involves starting off on a journey to find something new. And the decision to move forward cannot be overstated in this of how important it really is. Now, the third problem that we're going to run into, and this is going to be enormous for Dawkins in his example. How is it that natural selection is so incredibly patient to wait for the prize on top of the mountain to evolve? I want to give you two quotes, one from Richard Dawkins and one from Charles Darwin. And I want you to see how well they work together, but I also want you to see how well they refute the example of climbing Mount Improbable. Let's start with Richard Dawkins. Religion is so wasteful, so extravagant, and Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. Nature is a miserly accountant, grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest extravagance. Okay, we'll unpack that in a second. Let's talk about Darwin's example, which Darwin's going to drive home the same point as well. On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection or survival of the fittest. There's our textbook definition of natural selection. But you can see in this the problem. Natural selection, both by Darwin and Dawkins' admission, is an impatient, I love Dawkins' term actually, miserly accountant, pinching the pennies, making sure that any waste is immediately eliminated. The problem that you've got in a journey like this ought to become readily apparent. Let's stick with the eye as an example. Along the first step of the journey, the eye does nothing. I think Darwin, and again in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, Darwin jumps into the middle of the process. And instead of starting at the beginning, he starts off with a nerve that's light sensitive and things like that, and he begins evolving it from there. That's way into the process of developing an eye. And you can't just take that jump and start in the middle. At the beginning, the body has no idea that there is a prize on top of the mountain. We have no reason to have started the journey. And so along the way, this idea that somehow you have a piece of something special growing, nobody knows that it's something special until it reaches a point of being so. By Darwin's own admission, again, this preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection. Along the way of evolving an eye, unless natural selection suddenly again gains godlike powers and patience, why in the world would the creature that's beginning to evolve eyesight or beginning to involve sight at all have any natural advantage over its other competitors in the cycle of natural selection or survival of the fittest? And this goes way beyond this when you think about things like wings for flying, legs for walking, lungs for breathing. Why is it that natural selection suddenly becomes patient and allows for a process to continue forward that not only has no apparent benefit to the creature, would in many cases be injurious to the creature? It's going to be a waste of resources, it's going to be a waste of energy, and it's certainly not going to be something useful. As a creature starts to evolve these traits and features, it may be hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands of years before you go from a beginning point to any place where there's anything useful in the process. From the beginning of sight to something that actually resembles sight would take hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. How is it that natural selection is patient enough to wait for this? Our hike to the top of the mountain over here over my left shoulder, 12 and a half hours. It was an enormously challenging process. We actually got to the summit and we sat down at the summit and we busted out some snacks. And a friend of mine looked at me that I was hiking with and said, maybe we ought to call it a day. Before we hike down into that valley and have to hike all the way back up, maybe we should call it a day. And I still remember the choice he gave me. And we hiked down and I said, no, we're here. We're going to do this. This is a once in a lifetime chance. And we hiked our way down. And the hike back out was so steep. I remember us sitting down and taking a break. And I looked at him and I said, how much do you think it would be for a helicopter to come in here and evacuate us out of here? And he laughed and said, I don't know, man, maybe like $10,000 or something. And I said, right now, I think I'd write that check. It was a brutally difficult hike. But along the way, we had the patience and endurance to make the choice to continue forward. Unless we infuse natural selection with godlike powers, it's not going to do that. So again, there's no reason natural selection would recognize the prize. There's no reason it would start the journey. And there's certainly no reason, based on Richard Dawkins and Charles Darwin's own description of natural selection, that natural selection would be patient enough to wait. The only way this works is if you sneak intelligence into the equation again. That somehow natural selection has been infused with godlike powers, and it can be miserly and unforgiving at one place once something already exists, but until something exists, miraculously, it has the intelligence to be patient and allow these traits to develop. How is that possible? The fourth and the final piece, and I want to read through this again, because I want us to understand his argument one more time. The idea that this unguided process can move forward, when we really think about the analogy, falls apart very, very quickly, all on its own. I want to read Dawkins again. In Climbing Mount Improbable, I express the point in a parable. On one side of the mountain is a sheer cliff impossible to climb, but on the other side is a gentle slope to the summit. On the summit sits a complex device such as an eye or a bacterial flagellar motor. The absurd notion that such complexity could spontaneously self-assemble is symbolized by leaping from the foot of the cliff to the top in one bound. Evolution, by contrast, goes around the back of the mountain and creeps up the gentle slope to the summit. Easy. Okay, so I'm going to put on the table, I don't think anybody who's ever climbed a mountain would describe the process as easy. If you climbed a mountain and you described it as easy, I would argue you probably climbed a hill and not a mountain. And climbing a mountain is rarely easy. There are easier ones than others, but it's always a challenge. And I speak from experience on this. When I climbed that mountain at age 30, a few years before, I had attempted to climb my first mountain, and I failed. And I failed because I normally live at sea level. And in climbing that mountain, about the time we crossed 12,000 feet, I ran out of air. And my body was starving for oxygen, and I could take a few steps at a time before I would have to stop and take a break. And the closer we got to the summit, the more I ran out of oxygen. And finally, I looked at my friends who I was hiking with, and I said, you guys go do it. You summit. I'm going to keep trying, but you guys go summit, and I'll do the best I can to catch up. And it was a crack of thunder in the distance that finally snapped me into reality that I wasn't going to make it. And I turned around and started heading back down. And in the process of doing so, making bad decisions because I was starved for oxygen, I nearly walked off that cliff. And that would have been a very unpleasant end to my day as I was making bad choices. But that entire experience resonates with me as I think about this. And the end of his description creeps up the gentle slope to the summit. Easy. You know, the route that we took to the top of that mountain was fairly easy, but there were so many things conspiring against us, I never made it. Climbing a mountain is rarely easy, and when you do so, you go through a process of choosing your route and analyzing topographical maps and looking at where you're going to go. Are you going to be on a trail or off a trail? The hike that we did when I was 30, we had to do it in a year where it was a low snowpack year. Because the trail out, you had to go up an area of the mountain that's normally covered in very deep snow. And you can only do that hike in years when there's a low snowpack. So there's a lot of planning and a lot of effort that goes into this. But the idea that natural selection can go around to the back of the mountain and just kind of meander its way to the top, again begs the question, how does it know where to go? It's a slow, gentle process, and I understand the parable that he's trying to tell, and I get it. But in an unguided process, at every step of the way, you risk natural selection turning and walking the other direction, or stopping and falling apart altogether. In any unguided process, there's no good direction that's happening. Natural selection works by basically finishing off by, again, this idea of survival of the fittest, by removing from the gene pool lesser evolved creatures or creatures that don't have that trait that is moving things along. But it's by no guarantee. The evolutionary process, as it's envisioned in this, is very messy. It has to survive through multiple generations. It has to survive the process of reproduction. There's so many steps along the way where it can be lost and simply go in the wrong direction. Evolving something like the eye is an enormously complex process, putting together an enormously complex device. We will talk about that much later down the road. But along the way, at any given point, something can go wrong, and you can take a wrong turn and head off a cliff, or head in the wrong direction, or simply run out of gas and never make it to the top. Even if you've recognized that there's a prize on the top, even if you've made the decision to start, even if you have the patience and endurance to get there, it's laughable to say that it's easy for a human being guided by intelligence to make it to the top. It's ridiculous to say so for an unguided process, unless, again, you inject intelligence into the equation. And that's, I'm afraid, what we see happening here. So I wanted to go through this today, and I wanted to walk step by step through Mount Improbable. And the reality is, rather than climbing Mount Improbable, we have a much better chance of falling off Mount Improbable, I'm afraid, along the way. Next week, we're going to jump into DNA and RNA and talk about that. But I wanted to do this today because, again, I think this is something we can refer back to before we talk about Richard Dawkins and his evolutionary algorithm from the Blind Watchmaker, which we'll be talking about next week in regards to DNA and RNA. I think it was important to start this journey because the two are actually quite similar. If you've liked today's episode, and I hope you have, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button and possibly the subscribe button to the channel. You can always find us on our website at prooftograce.com. You can reach out to us at prooftograce@yahoo.com via email. And you can find our podcasts on Yahoo, iTunes, and Spotify. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And I want to have a little spoiler alert here in all of this. At the end of this journey, what we're going to find is that the prize on top of the mountain is you. You are the prize on top of the mountain. And it was through great love and care and intelligence that you were put together. You are that special. And I hope you never forget that. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.